A lie told in two languages is a blade that cuts without bleeding. It turns a promise into a trap, set in the silent, invisible space where one language ends and another begins. And once the ink touches the paper, the signature becomes a trigger, pulled before the bullet is ever felt. High above the freezing waters of Lake Michigan, in the claustrophobic opulence of a Chicago VIP penthouse, where empires were carved up over glasses of aged bourbon, a trap was closing, the syllable by treacherous syllable. Marilyn felt it in the heavy, charged air of the room, a fatal dissonance beneath the muted howl of the wind against the glass. She moved along the edge of the mahogany table with a practiced invisibility, a ghost in a crisp white shirt and black fitted vest, her presence designed to fade completely into the luxury of seamless service. But she was not invisible. She was merely observing from a blind spot no one thought to check. Her hands, unsteady as she cleared away the empty crystal tumblers, did not betray the sharp spike of adrenaline in her veins as she listened to the bespectacled translator weave his fatal lie. She had survived as a ghost for years, ever since the corporate syndicates had burned her former life as a top-tier linguist to the ground, leaving her in this careful, quiet exile. Tonight, however, the quiet was shattering, and the silver fountain pen hovering just millimeters above the contract was about to bleed. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Mafia Chronicles, and comment below where you're listening from. Marilyn J. Nellis moved through the heavy, bourbon-scented air of the VIP lounge with the practiced grace of a ghost. Her crisp, white button-down and black-fitted vest stripped her of identity, reducing her to a seamless function of the room's exorbitant hourly rate. She gathered empty crystal tumblers from the edge of the sprawling mahogany table, her sharp, focused eyes fixed firmly downward. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, tight bun, an armor of absolute professionalism. It was safer to remain unnoticed. Looking up meant seeing the faces of the men who ruled this city's ruthless underbelly. At the head of the table sat Minchell Chu. He was a portrait of calculated stillness, his tailored black suit cut sharp against his squared shoulders. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with striking, enshadowed cheekbones and meticulously slicked-back black hair. Just above his collar, the jagged edge of a dark neck tattoo hinted at the precise, cold violence required to ascend to his position. Yet, despite his dominant posture and the heavy, polished steel of the luxury watch on his wrist, a faint sheen of sweat clung to his temple. He was a man suspended in the agonizing fraction of a second before a massive, irreversible commitment. His right hand, gripping a heavy black and silver fountain pen, hovered completely frozen over the signature line of a sprawling logistics contract. Across from him sat the rival executives, projecting the easy, arrogant confidence of men who believed they had already won. Sitting between the two parties was the architect of the impending betrayal, a bespectacled East Asian man in a conservative dark suit and white tie. He was Minchell's translator, acting as a seemingly neutral, a watchful bridge between the rival syndicate and the boss's sprawling empire. But Marilyn was no ordinary waitress. Before a smear campaign had dismantled her career and exiled her to this silent life, she had been a brilliant corporate linguist. As she wiped condensation from the polished wood, the bespectacled man adjusted his glasses and spoke to his boss in fluent Korean. His tone was perfectly measured, but the words were a masterclass in deception. He was systematically altering a fatal forfeiture clause, assuring Minchell the terms were standard and safe. Marilyn's breath caught, the trap was set, and the silver pen began its final descent toward the paper. The bespectacled translator's voice was a low, soothing hum against the backdrop of the howling Chicago wind. To the untrained ear, his cadence was perfectly professional, merely bridging the gap between two deeply suspicious parties. But to Marilyn, every syllable was a loaded gun. As she lingered at the edge of Minchell's periphery, adjusting the placement of a crystal water pitcher, her heart beginning a slow, violent thud against her ribs. The rival executive, a man with a smug, razor-thin smile, spoke in rapid English. He detailed a devastating clause regarding the immediate forfeiture of operational control over Minchell's primary Midwest distribution hubs in the event of a single delayed shipment. It was a poison pill, explicitly designed to bleed the Korean syndicate dry and strip them of their assets within a fiscal quarter. The translator turned to Minchell, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. When he spoke in Korean, the poison was masterfully extracted. He assured his boss with a calm, watchful neutrality that the clause was nothing more than a standard compliance agreement, a routine audit protocol meant only to satisfy the rival syndicate's cautious board of directors. And it was a staggering act of sabotage. The translator was not just softening the terms, he was systematically dismantling Minchell's empire right in front of him, brick by treacherous brick. Marilyn watched the Mafia boss closely. Minchell's brows were slightly furrowed, his dark eyes focused but distant as his mind processed the translated lie. The muscles in his strong jawline flexed beneath the light stubble. A predator's instinct was warring with a businessman's logic. Not his tight lips and the faint sheen of sweat on his temple betrayed a deep, agonizing internal conflict. He sensed the dissonance in the room, the invisible threat lurking beneath the polished mahogany and expensive bourbon, but he was completely blind to its source. The man he paid to be his voice of truth was the Viper. The silver fountain pen hovered mere millimeters from the dotted line, gripped tightly in Minchell's right hand. His shoulders were squared, subtly tense, frozen in the heavy silence before commitment. Marilyn felt a cold, familiar fury rise within her. It was the exact same clinical, corporate malice that had orchestrated her own downfall years ago. The nib of the heavy silver pen descended, casting a sharp, metallic shadow over the contract. The reflection of the Chicago skyline in the penthouse glass seemed to blur as Marilyn's mind was yanked violently into her past. She had spent 2 grueling years perfecting the art of being a ghost. Long before she donned the crisp white shirt and the fitted black vest, she had been a formidable architect of international arbitration, a linguist who could dismantle complex corporate negotiations in 3 different languages before her morning coffee. But that life had been burned to the ground. A syndicate much like the one sitting across from Minchell had orchestrated a flawless smear campaign against her, fabricating digital evidence until her stellar reputation dissolved into nothing. They had left her professionally exiled and terrified of the very boardrooms she once commanded. She had promised herself she would never step back into the crosshairs. This waitress job was her sanctuary of absolute invisibility. Yet as the heavy silence of the VIP lounge pressed against her, the stench of the translator's deceit became suffocating. It was the exact same methodology that had ruined her. The quiet confidence, the surgical manipulation of contractual terms, like the utter lack of conscience. She was watching a powerful man being led off a cliff by a guide he trusted implicitly. If she stayed silent, she remained safe. Minchell Chu would sign away his logistics empire. The bespectacled translator would collect his Judas fee, and tomorrow, Marilyn would still have a quiet life. But the ghost of the woman she used to be screamed against the injustice. The moral calculus was terrifyingly simple. To stand by and watch the deliberate, systematic demolition of this man's enterprise was to become an accomplice to the exact brand of corporate malice that had destroyed her own life. Her knuckles whitened as her grip tightened on the crystal water pitcher. The luxurious penthouse seemed to fade, replaced by the sterile, devastating memory of her own ruin. She could not let another person be erased by a well-dressed lie. The fear that had kept her paralyzed in the shadows for years suddenly fractured, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She drew a quiet, steadying breath, letting the protective armor of the waitress persona slip away entirely. The silver fountain pen hovered a mere millimeter from disaster. Leaving the safety of the periphery, Marilyn took a deliberate, silent step forward. The heavy silver fountain pen felt like an anvil in Minchell's grip. He stared at the dotted line, his sharp, dark eyes tracking the microscopic descent of the nib. The faint sheen of sweat on his temple reflected the low, ambient light of the Chicago penthouse. His instincts, honed in the unforgiving hierarchy of the underworld, screamed that the room's curated harmony was entirely wrong, a dangerous dissonance vibrating in the air. Yet the bespectacled translator sat with calm, watchful neutrality, offering no warning. The rival executives leaned slightly forward, their arrogant confidence masked by polite patience. The nib touched the thick, textured paper. A single, A microscopic drop of black ink bled into the fibers. Across the room, Marilyn's heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic, trapped bird. Her palms were slick with cold sweat, but as she set the crystal pitcher down, her hands were rock steady. This was the muscle memory of her former life taking over, the flawless performance of absolute competence under suffocating pressure. The silence in the VIP lounge was deafening, broken only by the distant, a muffled howl of the wind and the rhythmic ticking of the luxury steel watch on Mincheol's tense wrist. She could not let the ink dry. To remain a ghost in this moment was to be an active accomplice to a corporate assassination. Abandoning the safety of the room's periphery, Marilyn moved toward the head of the sprawling mahogany table. Her steps were measured and entirely silent on the plush carpet, in her crisp white shirt and black vest a stark contrast to the high-end tailoring of the men she was interrupting. She felt the immediate, electric shift in the room's atmosphere as she crossed the invisible boundary of service. The translator's observant eyes darted toward her, a flicker of annoyance breaking his neutral facade. Mincheol did not look up, his intense focus locked on the bleeding drop of ink, his right hand gripping the pen, shoulders squared but locked in deep internal conflict. Marilyn stopped directly at his left shoulder, stepping intimately close to the dangerous crime boss. She angled her body deliberately, shielding her face from the view of the rival executives and the treacherous translator. She braced one hand firmly against the edge of the table, leaning in so close she could smell the sharp, expensive notes of his cologne over the bourbon. The drop of ink had spread, but the signature had not yet formed. The moment of no return had arrived. The heavy air of the penthouse seemed to crackle as Marilyn breached the invisible perimeter of the mahogany table. The drop of ink had already stained the textured paper, a dark omen bleeding outward, but the decisive stroke of the signature had not yet begun. She moved with a silent, calculated grace, stepping directly to Mincheol's left side, her body angled to shield her mouth from the view of the others at the table. With her back turned to the bespectacled translator and the smirking executives, she braced one hand firmly against the polished wood. The intoxicating scent of expensive cologne and aged bourbon wrapped around her as she leaned in intimately close, her face mere inches from the Mafia boss's ear. The translator's voice faltered for a fraction of a second, his watchful eyes catching the sudden disruption of the waitress. But before anyone could voice a reprimand or summon security, Marilyn parted her lips. She bypassed the English language entirely, discarding the protective shield of her lower status uniform, and lowered her voice to a fierce, breathy whisper. "He is lying to you. Don't sign," she murmured in flawless, completely unaccented Korean. The physical reaction was instantaneous. Mincheol Chu froze. The heavy silver fountain pen, poised to drag the ink across the page, stopped dead in its tracks. Slowly, the powerful decision-maker turned his head. He did not flinch, nor did he pull away from her intimate proximity. Instead, he locked his dark, intense eyes with hers for a single searing second. Marilyn held his gaze, her expression stripped of all fear, radiating only a fierce, urgent determination. In the depths of his eyes, she saw the shift. The distant, conflicted fog of processing the deceptive translation vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. There was no visible shock or chaotic confusion on Mincheol's face. Instead, there was a terrifying, cold flash of absolute comprehension. He understood instantly. The dissonance he had felt all evening, the nagging predator's instinct that had caused the sweat to beat at his temple, was finally validated. He was staring at a waitress, but he recognized the unyielding authority of a peer who had just handed him a lifeline. Marilyn did not wait for a verbal response. She had lit the fuse and delivered the explosive truth right to the center of his empire. Straightening up with the quiet dignity of a woman who knew exactly what she had just risked, she withdrew her hand from the table. The room's power dynamic had just been violently shattered in a matter of seconds. As she turned her back to the frozen boss and the oblivious executives, the silence in the VIP lounge transformed into something heavy, lethal, and waiting to detonate. The heavy silver fountain pen, which had been millimeters away from signing away an empire, was lifted from the page. The single drop of ink remained, a dark, permanent stain on the textured paper, but the signature would never follow. Mincheol Chu straightened in his high-backed leather chair, placing the pen down with a soft, deliberate click that seemed to cannon through the breathless silence of the Chicago VIP penthouse. He did not display shock or chaotic confusion. Instead, there was only a flash of cold, terrifying comprehension as his predator's instincts violently aligned with the waitress's whispered warning. Marilyn gave a slight, formal nod, slipping back into the practiced invisibility of her crisp white shirt and black vest as she retreated toward the periphery of the room. Her back tingled, every nerve ending screaming in anticipation of the fallout. She had lit the fuse, and now all she could do was wait for the detonation, hoping she would not be caught in the blast of the Mafia boss's wrath. As she reached the shadows near the service door, the entire gravitational field of the room seemed to shift and pivot, collapsing inward around the explosive truth she had just delivered. An agonizing silence stretched across the mahogany table. The rival executives exchanged a brief, confused glance, their arrogant smiles faltering as the rhythm of the negotiation died. The bespectacled translator adjusted his glasses, a bead of nervous sweat suddenly materializing at his hairline. For a terrifying moment, Marilyn thought Minchale might have ignored her, dismissing her intervention as the ramblings of a delusional servant. But then, the quality of the atmosphere in the room irrevocably changed. When Minchale finally spoke, the placid, calculating tone he had maintained all evening was gone, replaced by something flat and hard, like a sheet of ice forming over the freezing waters of Lake Michigan. He did not look at the rival executives. His sharp, dark eyes locked entirely on the translator. He was watching the mechanics of the lie, studying the man's performance now that he knew it was a complete sham. He was methodically setting the trap. Raising a hand, Minchale offered a simple, commanding gesture that brought the entire meeting to a dead halt. The silence that fell this time was absolute, heavy with unspoken, lethal tension. "Why, would you be so kind as to repeat that last translated clause to our guests?" Minchale asked in flawless, unaccented English, a language he had deliberately pretended not to grasp all evening. "Verbatim, if you please." The color instantly drained from the translator's face. For the first time, his smooth, neutral composure fractured into a stammering panic as he desperately tried to reconstruct the lie he had just sold. The bespectacled translator's smile completely vanished, a barely perceptible tremor breaking the corner of his mouth. He opened his mouth, attempting to stammer out a reconstruction of the elaborate lie he had just fed to his boss. But Minchale Chu did not grant him the mercy of an answer. Instead, the powerful Mafia boss slowly turned his dark, chillingly calm gaze directly toward the rival executives seated across the mahogany table. The executives stared back, their mouths slightly agape as their minds scrambled to process the sudden, shocking plot twist unfolding in the penthouse. The foreign monolith they had so arrogantly assumed needed a linguistic bridge to their world had been standing on their side of the river the entire evening, listening to every single treacherous word. "Gentlemen," Minchale said, his voice both eloquent and disarming, "it appears there has been a significant misunderstanding, one I feel compelled to correct personally." Without raising his voice, Minchale proceeded to calmly and methodically deconstruct every lie the translator had woven over the past hour. He laid the stark, unvarnished truth bare on the polished wood between them. With each surgically precise sentence, the bespectacled traitor seemed to physically shrink, his conservative dark suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his trembling frame. The confrontation in the VIP lounge was not loud or explosive. It was quiet, clinical, and utterly devastating. The opulent room had abruptly transformed into a courtroom, and Minchale Chu was acting as the judge, jury, and executioner. 2 of his security guards, who had been standing impassively by the penthouse doors like statues, moved silently to flank the translator's chair. Their looming presence was the final, unspoken verdict. The logistics partnership was dead. The elaborate betrayal orchestrated by the rival syndicate had been ruthlessly exposed. From the shadows near the service corridor, Marilyn J. Nellis watched the empire-saving execution. She finally let out the breath she had been holding for what felt like an eternity, her rigid posture slumping slightly in a wave of terrifying, overwhelming relief. She had stopped the trigger from being pulled, but as she looked at Minchale's cold, calculating profile, she knew her carefully constructed invisibility was gone forever. The aftermath in the VIP penthouse was swift and utterly silent. The arrogant rival executives, their faces drained of color and twisted into a mixture of confusion and profound humiliation, were promptly escorted out through a discreet side exit by Minshall's guards. The bespectacled translator was taken away through another door, his expression entirely vacant with the shock of a man who knew his life was effectively over. The sprawling, opulent lounge, which had just been a theater for high-stakes corporate warfare, abruptly fell into a suffocating stillness. When the distant howl of the Chicago wind against the glass was the only sound remaining, Marilyn retreated into the shadows of the service corridor, her adrenaline crashing. She was preparing to clock out, desperate to slip away into the freezing anonymity of the city night before the reality of what she had just done could catch up to her. She unbuttoned her fitted black vest with trembling fingers, the fragile structure of her invisible life completely shattered. But before she could reach the sanctuary of the staff locker room, the lounge manager approached her, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "Mr. Chu wishes to see you," the manager said, his voice reduced to a terrified squeak. Every survival instinct Marilyn possessed screamed at her to run, to flee down the fire escape, disappear into the sprawling grid of downtown Chicago, and never look back. Intervening in the affairs of a mafia boss was practically a death sentence. And the men who had ruined her past were nothing compared to the danger radiating from this room. But the ghost of the brilliant linguist she used to be rooted her to the floor. She had already crossed the bridge. There was no going back to the quiet, grayscale existence she had endured for the past 2 years. She had come this far. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Marilyn smoothed down her crisp white shirt, adjusted her apron, and forced her rigid posture to relax. She turned away from the exit and walked slowly back down the dimly lit hallway. The heavy mahogany door to the VIP lounge loomed ahead of her, pulsing with a dangerous gravity. Pushing it open, she stepped back into the room. Minshall Chu was entirely alone, seated in the exact same spot at the head of the sprawling, empty table. The lethal logistics contract had been pushed aside, the leather folder closed decisively over the single drop of black ink. He sat in the low light, a single glass of water resting in front of him, waiting for the woman who had just saved his empire. Marilyn walked back into the room. Minshall Chu was alone, seated at the head of the now empty table, a single glass of water in front of him. The leather folder was closed. He gestured to the chair opposite him, the one the traitorous translator had occupied. Marilyn sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while for a long moment he simply studied her, his gaze intense and analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. "You speak my language fluently," he stated, the words hanging in the heavy air. It was not a question. "Yes, sir," Marilyn replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline still burning in her veins. "And you understand the intricacies of contract law." Again, a statement. "I used to." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. He noted that a waitress at a restaurant does not typically possess such a unique combination of skills, prompting him to ask her directly, "Who are you?" The question hung in the air, demanding more than just her name. It demanded her story. The dam she had built around her past finally broke. The words came out in a controlled, even tone, but they carried the weight of 2 years of suppressed grief and anger. "My name is Marilyn J. Nellis," she began, explaining that until 2 years ago, she was a senior associate specializing in international arbitration and had been on the fast track to a partnership. She told him everything about her past, detailing the rival corporate behemoth and their ruthless tactics. She explained how they had framed her for leaking sensitive client data during a major arbitration. They had created a false digital trail, bribed a technician for testimony, and systematically destroyed her reputation. She was professionally exiled and left with crippling legal debts. "I took this job because no one in the legal or corporate world would touch me," she finished, her voice quiet but clear. "I needed to disappear to be invisible." Minshall listened without interruption, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the penthouse. When she was done, he sat back in his high-backed leather chair, his fingers steepled in quiet contemplation. Though the pieces of the evening's elaborate trap clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about one bad translator. The rival syndicate that had just tried to bleed his empire dry was the exact same enemy that had bitten at her heels years ago. She hadn't just stumbled into a random act of corporate espionage. She had walked right back into the epicenter of her own destruction. In the days that followed, Marilyn existed in a state of suspended animation. She continued her shifts at the VIP lounge, the familiar routine a fragile anchor in a sea of uncertainty. The high-altitude suite remained empty, a silent monument to the night that had fractured her carefully constructed peace. One afternoon, as the freezing Chicago wind battered the skyline, a sleek black car pulled up outside. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit entered and asked for her by name. He was one of Minchale's men, and without a word of explanation, he handed her a thick sealed envelope. Marilyn took the envelope to the staff break room, her hands trembling as she tore it open. Inside, she found it wasn't a letter, but a comprehensive dossier containing dozens of pages of documents, internal syndicate emails, encrypted financial transactions, and detailed digital forensics reports. It was a complete systematic demolition of the case that had been built against her 2 years ago. And Minchale's team had not just investigated the bespectacled translator, they had exhumed her entire professional life, gathering irrefutable proof of her innocence. The documents were more than just evidence. They were the key to the cage she had been living in. As she read through the dossier Minchale's team had assembled, the full scope of the rival syndicate's predatory strategy came into terrifying focus. The translator from the penthouse was not an isolated operative, but a single highly effective tool in a vast arsenal of corporate warfare. The investigation revealed that the rival faction had a dedicated covert division focused solely on industrial sabotage. They placed compromised individuals, translators, junior analysts, administrative assistants, inside the operations of their targets and potential partners. These embedded operatives were trained to subtly alter data, misrepresent communications, and introduce small, and almost imperceptible points of friction into negotiations. Their goal was not to cause catastrophic failures, but to ensure that deals soured, trust eroded, and partnerships fell apart through 1,000 tiny cuts. But the most chilling revelation was the direct link between her own downfall and this larger campaign. The executive who had orchestrated the frame-up that ended her career was the exact same man in charge of the division targeting Minchale Chu. And she had not been a victim of random corporate malice. She had been one of the first casualties in a long, undeclared war. Holding the evidence in her hands, Marilyn realized she was no longer just a victim. She was a witness, armed with the truth, a weapon far more powerful than any lie. The file was a map of the enemy's territory, and she knew the terrain better than anyone. The next day, Marilyn stood before the towering glass and steel monolith of Minchale Chu's corporate headquarters. The simple waitress uniform was gone, replaced by a sharp charcoal gray suit she had kept preserved in plastic, a silent testament to a future she thought had been stolen from her. She walked across the polished marble, feeling as though returning to this high-stakes world was like stepping onto a foreign planet. An executive assistant met her in the lobby and escorted her to the top floor, as the elevator ascending in silence as the freezing Chicago skyline unfolded below them like a complex blueprint. When the doors opened into the vast, minimalist space, Minchale was not behind his desk. He was standing by the panoramic window looking out at the city, his back to her. He turned to face her, his expression serious, and gestured to a large conference table where the devastating dossier was laid out. He informed her that his team had reviewed the evidence and believed they had enough to launch a full-scale assault that would expose the rival syndicate's practices and dismantle their operations. Her expertise and the compiled evidence would be the cornerstone of that impending war. He warned her that this would mean stepping back into the light, where the corporate world she had tried to hide from would be watching her every move. Minchale's dark eyes locked onto hers with intense calculation. He clarified that he was not offering her a simple reward for stopping his pen the night before. He was offering her a permanent position within his inner circle. His organization needed someone who understood the intricate architecture of a deal, and more importantly, someone who knew the nature of the enemies trying to eat away at the foundation. He needed a formidable negotiator who could spot a weak joint from a mile away. Now Marilyn looked at the sprawling city below, realizing this was far more than a job offer. It was a chance at redemption and an opportunity to turn the greatest injustice of her life into her greatest strength. It was her chance to finally stop being a ghost and become a fortress. The dossier on the table was a weapon, and Minchell was offering her the chance to wield it for herself, to rewrite her own story. A new resolve hardened in Marilyn's eyes. She took a deep breath, the air-conditioned air of the high-altitude office feeling like the first clean breath of a new life. Meeting the Mafia boss's expectant gaze, she accepted the offer without hesitation, ready to defend her new empire. The final scene of Marilyn's transformation does not unfold with dramatic courtroom battles or triumphant newspaper headlines. Instead, the true victory is quietly realized 6 months later, half a world away from the freezing winds of Chicago. Inside a heavily guarded boardroom in Seoul, Marilyn J. Nellis, dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored dark blue suit, stands confidently beside Min-chul Chu. The sprawling mahogany table before them is no longer a site of ambush, but a map of their expanding empire. She is briefing his executive team before a major international negotiation, her voice unwavering and her command of the intricate material absolute. Every syllable she speaks is measured, strategic, or lethal to their competitors. She moves through the high-stakes environment with an earned authority, her presence completely filling the room. She is no longer the invisible ghost she had forced herself to become. As she concludes the briefing, laying out the exact linguistic and contractual traps they will use to corner their remaining rivals, she is undeniably visible, powerful, and whole. The executives around the table nod in silent reverence, not just to Minchell's formidable power, but to the brilliant consigliere who now engineers his syndicate's most dangerous corporate moves. The bespectacled translator and the rival factions that once tried to dismantle them are nothing but ashes in their wake. Marilyn lets the silence settle over the executives, her eyes drifting for a brief moment to her own hands, resting on the polished surface of the table. They do not tremble. They are rock steady, the capable hands of a master builder. The trauma of her professional exile and the crushing fear that had kept her hiding in a waitress uniform are completely gone. The memory of her ruined past is no longer a suffocating weight dragging her down. It has become the unbreakable foundation of her new life. By choosing to step out of the shadows and whisper the truth into the ear of a Mafia boss, she had honored her own legacy on her own unforgiving terms. Armed with the sharpest intellect in the room, Marilyn had successfully crossed her own bridge from utter ruin to absolute redemption, discovering in the process that the strongest, most unyielding structures in the criminal and corporate worlds are not made of steel, concrete, or even ink. They are built of courage,